This video is on a book called Brain Energy by Dr. Chris Palmer. And now, what if I were to tell you that mental health isn't really all that mental? That's right. What if it has to do with something more, the metabolism, and actual energy? And I don't mean energy in a mystical way, but literally how the brain and body process energy. Okay, this is known as, of course, metabolism, which is that thing you sometimes hear about of like, oh, I want to raise my metabolism or whatever, which is all these things that hormones, muscle mass, body fat, it's really the term for how the body utilizes and processes energy. So we're going to make the surprising case in summarizing a book called Brain Energy by Dr. Chris Palmer that maybe there's something more to this equation. And the benefit you'll get, especially if you stick around to the end, is some 5 pretty practical lessons and takeaways that you may consider applying personally, but also can just change more broadly our perspective on mental disorders, on mental illness, and then on the flip side, on mental health. And it starts with this idea that mental illness is kind of on the rise. The mental health status in our society these days is not in a very good place. And this is despite billions of dollars being invested in new treatments and pharmaceutical interventions and programs and all these different things. They don't seem to be working. And that's what set up Dr. Chris Palmer to investigate some hidden channels here. And like I said, it's just kind of a surprising science and surprising perspective on mental health. So let's get into it. Again, this is a summary of a book called Brain Energy, a revolutionary breakthrough in understanding mental health and improving treatment for anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, and more. Kind of a long title, Chris, by Dr. Chris Palmer. Now, this guy is a fascinating guy. He's a Harvard psychiatrist, and he has experience in clinical practice, treating people one-to-one with all sorts of mental disorders and mental illnesses. And then he now heads basically all these various research initiatives associated with Harvard Medical School, and he's become a pioneer in the field of psychiatry and understanding mental health. And so the big idea here, first of all, if you want a very technical and kind of scientific understanding of mental health and mental illness, then you may consider reading the book. Okay? And I say that because he goes into some detail on primary research, and not just that, but like the actual physiology and biology and sort of hard science behind how a lot of this stuff works. So if you want to kind of go into the weeds and have a like technical experience, I suggest you read his book. If you want a little more big picture, the main ideas, I suggest you stick with a video like this and maybe some other summaries. Of course, you can find some online. But here is the big idea. All mental disorders are metabolic disorders. So consider this, that the brain, for its small weight, uses a disproportionate amount of energy. And he says the common pathway for all mental illnesses, minor to severe, is metabolic dysfunction. And the way he kind of discovered this is just noticing like a common theme between all these different areas where people would maybe have some issues with weight, and that would show up in some things like anxiety or depression. And then you'd have people who had schizophrenia, for instance, also dealing with weight. And it was like, it seemed like all of these different things on some level had to do with how the brain and body use energy. And so he started to investigate this metabolic connection. And so what we have to understand is we should view mental disorders as metabolic disorders, as not so much issues of the mind, but of how the body uses and processes energy. And then that sets us up to think about treatments to restore mental health should focus on metabolic factors. And these will be things like diet, exercise, sleep, and stress levels. Okay, and behaviors that go into that. So I'm going to give you 5, again, kind of big picture lessons from this text as a summary. And if you want to go deeper, I suggest you check out the book or find some other resources online. You can visit Dr. Chris Palmer's website as well. That'll point you to a lot of wonderful resources on this topic. So First one is in our kind of flawed and outdated view of mental disorders. Right now, they essentially follow this logic. Okay, so imagine this. I had a headache, I took an Advil or an ibuprofen, and I felt better. So that means that I must have Advil deficiency disorder. It doesn't make sense, right? You say, well, if I take an ibuprofen every day, that I will feel better. But clearly the issue is not a lack of ibuprofen, right? Because in nature, I wouldn't be taking Advil or ibuprofen. There must be something more to the picture. And this is the analogy he uses for like mental disorders. I mean, it's kind of like saying something where you're like, okay, I am feeling depressed or something. Okay. And so they say, okay, well, depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. That's the term we always hear, right, for mental disorders. It's a chemical imbalance. And so if you take this pharmaceutical drug, then you will be back to being healthy again. And so keep in mind here, this is not a total criticism of SSRIs or antidepressants, but just follow me on the logic, right? It's like, okay, you have a chemical imbalance in the brain that's making you depressed, so we need to give you a chemical to fix that imbalance and you're better. But this sets up a really big question. Why the chemical imbalance? It's just like that ibuprofen deficit disorder example I gave. If I get a headache every day and I take Advil to make it better, it's like, well, that's fine, but why do you have the headache in the first place? Same thing on the mental illness side. So often we just say, well, it's a chemical imbalance. But why the chemical imbalance? That is what we have to understand. So that is the question, and that is the first thing that required this kind of perspective shift on how we view mental disorders. The second is we have to understand the size of this problem and the fact that a lot of our approach hasn't worked in the past. Mental disorders are the most common cause of disability on the planet, and the truth is our current treatment models don't work very well. So, for example, despite dozens of antidepressants therapies, we even have electro and magnetic brain stimulation. We've tried ketamine, right? We have other chemical interventions and now psychedelics, which I will add that there has been some positive, promising research that psychedelics are a fairly effective treatment for some mental disorders, as well as ecstasy now being used to treat particularly PTSD. But still, broadly speaking, most of these treatments have a fairly low level of effectiveness and sustainability. And then depression, for instance, is the single most disabling illness in the world. So it's like, despite all these advances and therapies and all the different pills and all the different chemical interventions and all these treatments we do, even therapy, which again, I'm a big supporter of therapy and psychotherapy, none of these treatment models are all that effective. And that's evidenced by the fact that this is still the number one disease in the world. So we've set up here, okay, our perspective is clearly a little flawed, and given how common these issues are, our approach isn't really working. So what? Okay, well, this is the next set of ideas. Mitochondria, these are kind of the powerhouse of the cell. They regulate metabolism, and therefore they regulate mental health. And interestingly, they respond to biopsychosocial factors. So that means it's not just about genes or chemicals, but your stress, your social conditions, and your trauma can actually affect cellular metabolism and disrupt brain function. So again, here's how this works, right? Your brain is using a disproportionate amount of energy. So if there's anything in this whole process of converting food into energy, into the cells, and then that's kind of flowing through the networks into the brain, right? If there's any slight tweaks or disruptions there in how the mitochondria function, it could be a small thing that's not quite firing right, your mood's a little off, you're feeling a little less energized, to full-on schizophrenia, where you're having these sort of hallucinations and voices and all these things. And so mitochondria play a key role here, and this is the critical understanding, is we have this biopsychosocial model in psychology, which again means there are biological factors on the chemical level and genetic level. There are psychological factors, which means that literally stressors in your life or traumatic events can actually affect cellular metabolism. And then you have the same thing, social factors, where the social environment that you're embodied in, that context, can also impact cellular function. And so what we see is that all these different factors can undermine our metabolic health. You can imagine someone who they have disordered or disrupted sleep. So they're not sleeping well because they're doing shift work. Okay, so that's number one. And then on top of that, they don't have time to exercise. And then because they live in a low income area, they have a food desert. So they eat super healthy, high processed sugary foods, and maybe they abuse alcohol and maybe even some other drugs. So there's a bunch of kind of biological factors that are undermining their health. Then we turn to psychological. Well, maybe they had a traumatic upbringing and now they feel a lot of financial uncertainty and the constant stress of having to work their minimum wage job. Okay, once again, those psychological stressors are manifesting in a metabolic level, because when stress floods our body with cortisol and these other toxic hormones, it can literally affect the cells. And then finally, the social factors. Let's say this person is struggling and they don't have a great social support group and they're feeling isolated and lonely. Same thing. Loneliness has been shown to have actual physiological effects. And the impact on long-term health is similar to being a chronic smoker or dealing with obesity. So this kind of constellation of biological, psychological, and social factors is undermining the metabolic health of this person. And then it's more likely that they're going to manifest mental disorders. Okay, so I hope with these few ideas so far we've covered that we need to kind of shift our perspective a little bit to just thinking about, oh, it's in the mind, or positive thinking, or you need to just take an antidepressant, to, okay, under the surface, the kind of root cause here, how are we driving metabolic dysfunction in our society, in our individual experience, and also some of the biological factors. So here are some final considerations for how we can fix this or address it. The first is shifting on kind of the perspective we take as a collective and in the scientific community to the role of metabolic health. And so that doesn't mean, all right, well, you're not going to go to therapy, or you're not going to process your trauma, or you're not going to learn any psychological tools. We're just going to have you run a marathon. No. It's not that simple. But that is the first shift, is to look at big picture. How do we improve metabolic health through things like proper regular sleep, good physical exercise, healthy diet, and then the psychological factors as well. So how do we cope with stress, right? How do we generate more positive emotional contexts and emotional states? And how do we manage our difficult thoughts? And then social, how do we support people coming together and reduce the kind of loneliness epidemic, which I could do a separate video just on that theme, but that we have been facing in Western society, particularly for the last 20 or 30 years. And so Dr. Chris Palmer lays out kind of some prescriptions here. So to restore brain health, what you need to do is restore metabolism. You need to normalize a healthy metabolism. So use a diet. In his cases, he's actually found that an intense ketogenic diet for people with very extreme mental illnesses has been quite effective. And it helps. It's kind of odd, but he had an experiment where he even kind of worked with someone who had pretty severe schizophrenia, got them on a ketogenic diet, and it helped normalize and regulate their metabolism. So if you are in a pretty extreme case, or you know someone who is, they should be getting proper medical attention if they're that extreme. But maybe experimenting with the diet there. And if you're just kind of a normal person, maybe it's just kind of a healthy diet with fewer highly processed sugars and carbohydrates and things like that. Regular exercise is essential, particularly zone 2 cardio, which is going to be probably about 120 to 140 beats per minute, but a good barometer is it's the maximum level of cardio that you can do while still being able to have a conversation. It might not be a totally comfortable conversation, but you can imagine if you're sprinting, you're just like, you're not going to be able to breathe. But if you're kind of jogging and you can still maybe take a few breaths, but you can have a conversation as you go, that is the type you want to train at, aiming for ideally, and I know this is a lot, 2 hours per week is a good number to aim for. You'll also want to limit drugs and alcohol, as those can disrupt metabolic function, reduce stress, and seek therapy for trauma or for unhelpful mental patterns, right? All of those things are going to help, remember, because there's a mind-body connection here where psychological and social stressors actually manifest into cellular function and impact our metabolism. And I mean, even a firsthand example of that is like, if you ever feel really anxious and really stressed and you don't feel hungry, okay, that's not a super whatever scientific experiment, but it's just showing you again that there are connections here from the brain and the nervous system into the body and the metabolic system. Improve sleep, and that will get you most of the way there. So again, one piece of this is a big perspective shift in viewing mental health as one and the same with metabolic health, and then things you can do, particularly if you are struggling. Of course, talk to a therapist, a psychologist, get proper attention and care. But as you do this, pay close attention to, in that approach for improving your mental health, whatever your baseline is, that it should be really grounded in metabolic health, which comes down to sleep health, proper diet, okay, healthy whole foods, low and highly processed sugars, exercise, particularly adequate cardiovascular exercise, and managing stress effectively. Number 5, developing close social relationships, a sense of community, and quality interactions there. And all those things I just shared are not just things, oh, maybe it would be nice to do this, I want to lose 5 pounds so I look good. No. These are the foundation for mental health. And again, this can apply if you're kind of struggling there and you want to get back to baseline, or if you're in a pretty good place and want to optimize mental health. This is kind of the key takeaway and the big ideas from Dr. Chris Palmer. So I hope that was a good summary with some kind of context, but also some practical application there. As always on this channel, I share resources and insights from the art and science of happiness studies. Here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like. If you enjoy this video, I suggest you check out my channel or some of my other resources down below. So thank you for watching. This has been your happiness nerd, Jackson Kirchis. I'll see you next time.